Brilliant. Hi, everyone. Oh, it's so exciting to see you. And what a beautiful day. And I'm sure, like many of you, you just want to be outside in the park. And it's just a bit frustrating, but it's lovely to see you all. Thank you for inviting me. So I thought I'd just start with a sort of 10-minute sort of where we are, what's going on with Parliament, what's going on with the party, what's going on with the country. Not very long, and mainly have time to answer your questions. In particular for me, I'm really keen to hear the issues that you guys are having. I think I'll start by saying I think there is a real problem emerging, which is that those who are going to be disproportionately badly affected by coronavirus and the crisis, particularly the economic crisis, is actually you guys. It's people in university who would at this point be normally coming out and entering the job market. I've been talking to a lot of vice chancellors as well about what's going on with courses and exams and what happens to those who might want, for example, to get funding for research projects. And there's a whole host of issues that are really not being talked about right now for uni students in particular. And so if you've got thoughts and you want to tell me about them so that we can take them up and include them in some of the stuff I'm talking about, please do. So this is the chance. I'll very much start by saying, you know, I really, really feel for everybody. I think, yes, we are all in the same boat, but we also are not, frankly. I mean, there's lots and lots of people who are really struggling right now. Mental health is a massive issue. The isolation is really, really difficult. I don't know what your personal circumstances are, but it can be really stressful being back with your families for such extended periods of time if you're not used to it, or if you're in halls, for example, and it's not really geared up for this. That's really, really stressful. I do genuinely hope you're all taking care of yourself and taking care of each other. I think it's great that CULA have put on talks like this to keep people amused and engaged. And as far as I'm concerned, we are a big Lib Dem family and we are here to support each other. So I think it's important to say that at the start, and please do reach out if there's anything that we can do in any way. So to where we are in terms of COVID-19, it's almost like society started to rewrite itself when we went into lockdown. It was extraordinary. There's real genuine questions, I think, about how quickly the government acted, how it acted. Happy to come back to some of these things. Today I've been calling around a bit more transparency around who sits on SAGE, which is the scientific advice group that feeds into government, not because I think they've done anything wrong, but I think that transparency and understanding how these decisions are being made is a good thing and is important for scrutiny. And I do think that the government has done a pretty good job of saying, we're just going to let the science tell us what to do. Well, any of you who are on the call, I know some of you are, who are scientists, will appreciate that there are huge confidence intervals that are being dealt with here. There are political judgments in and among the scientific data that they are seeing. It is a complete cop-out to suggest that the science leads this and there is one correct answer. There isn't. And if you wanted evidence of that, just look at the range of different ways this has been approached by different countries around the world. So I've been calling for that today. And I think, you know, as a former science teacher, I think it's great that people are now talking about science, thinking about how important it is. I think it's really important for making the case for why education is a good thing, why we need to be encouraging people to learn and grow. And there's a whole thing around retraining, which I think is really important. But that said, I do think that there are questions that need to be asked around why we weren't more prepared for PPE crisis that we are now seeing, why we hadn't procured enough ventilators. Now, as I understand the position right now is that we are in a slightly better position in terms of like the NHS Nightingale hospitals than we thought we would be at this stage. So that's a good thing. But also I've noticed, particularly around Cambridge, that there's also some very interesting responses to this crisis from the police, who seem to have taken a slightly more heavy-handed approach in some parts of the country than others. And there's a whole host of different things that as Liberal Democrats we need to be getting ourselves into and making sure that we are standing up for people for. So let's just look sort of at that country level stuff. So I started by saying I do think the young are going to be disproportionately affected. No one's really talking about that, and it's something I'm going to start to talk about more, because there's this huge inequity. You know, we've got on the one hand very asset rich, pension rich, older people who I think are, you know, much more resilient than people who are sort of under, particularly 35. I would say I kind of was okay because I came out of university just sort of before the financial crash and got my toehold. So I had my first job by then. I look at my sister, who's just 3 years younger, and my brother and sister, 8 years younger. They came out just after the financial crash, and they really struggled. You know, they were all at one point or another on the dole, and that just became part of their lives. They are now again going to be affected by this, and I think there's also going to be an issue around young people who are going to be affected by this, and it plays its part throughout the whole of your career, and I think it's a real issue, and we need to take it really seriously. There's also an issue around BME communities. We don't understand yet how the data is shaking out. Is it that people are genetically more susceptible to this, which does happen with some diseases, or is it that actually they are more likely to be frontline workers and more likely to be socioeconomically deprived? Is that the reason why 33% of the people who have died from it in hospitals are BME, when in fact it's 18% of the population? I do think there's some things that we need to look at there. And then there's the what happens next part, and we are thinking quite deeply about that. You know, is the world going to be the same after COVID than it was before? Is it a case that we're just going to hope that it all just goes away and that we can press the reset button and it was like it was, you know, mid-February again? I think, bluntly, I think the answer to that is no. I think the world is forever changed. Politically, it's very interesting. There's been a sort of palate cleanser, if you like, that has now been applied. It's not totally gone away. Those of you who are active on social media and Twitter and all the rest of it, those Brexit wounds are still there, and the two tribes still very much exists. But nevertheless, I do think that there is a sort of palate cleanser that's happened in politics, and it'd be interesting to see where the Liberal Democrats can land after that point. So I'll now turn my remarks to the party. We're certainly in a very difficult position right now. It is very, very hard with the election of Keir Starmer, particularly taking up any of the airtime for those of us who would normally be sort of all over the news talking about all sorts of things and getting our party profile up. It's actually quite slim pickings out there. We're doing our best. And actually today was a fairly good day for that for me, and I'm talking about a range of issues, but nevertheless, it's been really very difficult. Hot off the press, and I'm sure some of you will have seen, and this is not unrelated, I think it's not helpful that we just don't have a leader with a mandate. We do have a leader, in fact we've got two, it's Mark Pack and Ed Davey, but I do think that that is a problem for us in terms of the weight of the intervention of the Liberal Democrats whenever we're trying to comment on something. I personally felt that the board's decision to delay the leadership election for a year was badly thought out. I mean, yes, I have declared that I want to be part of it, but actually not for me. More to the point, I want a strong party to be able to lead if I win. And I felt that a year without any of that political direction that's taken from having a leader with a direction, a political strategy and direction, is a bad thing. As it happens, the ruling that the board heard, actually they got it yesterday, and we found out yesterday, they've just released it online, is that they didn't have the mandate. The Constitution did not allow for them to extend for a year. It did allow for them to extend given the exceptional circumstances, and I think that's just logical. And I was always thinking that that might happen. But I did think a year was over the top. So the current position is that we are basically permanently suspended until such time as the exceptional circumstances lift. And I suppose that's the big question now that the federal board need to answer, is at what point do we consider it lifted? I'm pushing very hard for them to consider a mainly online election. You know, events like this show that, yes, I could have spent all the time coming to see you. And in fact, I know we've been trying to get me up to see you for some time. Actually, you can just arrange Zooms to do this. And it is entirely plausible that you can meet candidates and get their answers and grill them and all the rest of it. And that's all entirely possible. And you know, those who don't have access to the internet, we can mail stuff to. It's entirely possible. And I would argue that as a party that's calling for a fully virtual parliament at a time like this, to then suggest that we couldn't do that for a leadership election is just bizarre. So let's see what happens with that. I would very much hope they do that, but board is king. And so those of you who are ambitious within the party, do consider at some point a stint on federal board. It is an incredibly important body and has a lot of power. So I, at this point, will stop there because I've been talking for some time and I really want to hear your questions. So shoot, back to you, Freddie.
Thank you very much for that. So I think I'll start with what you mentioned a little bit earlier about what where we as a country go next. So let's talk about two things. First, how do you think we can possibly leave lockdown? So we know it's going to be extended probably into at least May, but at some point we're going to have to start unlocking the economy. What will you be pushing for? What sort of scrutiny should we be asking for? And secondly, I know you mentioned that Brexit's still an issue. Obviously, we're still on track to leave basically without a deal at the end of this year. So should the government extend the transition period? What can be done by the Liberal Democrats to exert pressure in that direction?
Yeah. So first of all, on the how do we exit bit, well, the short answer to that question is I don't think anyone truly knows. And this is the bit where I do think some transparency around where the models are now. We had a big push for the transparency for the Imperial College model to be released initially. And in fact, I know the lead researcher for that. They're actually an Oxford resident, and so I know them through here. And we had a good chat about it. And they are very open about there was a lot that was in that they didn't account for, not least they didn't include in it lockdown measures and the effect that they would have. So we've now done lockdown for a while, and I will be curious to know if they've crunched the numbers, and I'm sure they have, how that has affected the model. And what it's going to be showing us about the longer term prospects. It might also start to tell us some things around what has worked effectively or not. Because even though it was sort of every 2 days, and that's quite hard to work out and delineate in the data, it wasn't a case of we went into full lockdown immediately. Actually, schools closed first, then we kind of went into lockdown. It would be really interesting to see if there's anything that we can tell from that. Probably not, but let's see. I think in reality what's going to happen is we're going to slowly come out of lockdown. If we come out of it at all at this point, we're seeing that the number of hospital admissions seems to be plateauing, or at least not rising as high. It's not that exponential, it's now linear, and that's good. We then need to see if we are going to lift things, the effect that they're going to have. So it's going to be a very painfully slow exit from this lockdown. My personal view is that in the end, this is a public health crisis first. And yes, there is a lot of pain in the economy. I think there is more that the government can and should do. I've been calling very vociferously recently for a universal basic income as a crisis measure at this stage, although it'd be interesting to see if it's something that we'd want to keep as a country afterwards, mainly because so many people are being left out of the system. I mean, a good example being students are not allowed to access universal credit. We also have very many people who had recently changed jobs and so cannot be furloughed, and they found themselves on UC, which is a very imperfect system to begin with anyway. So all of these things, I think, are compelling reasons why we need to have a think about how do we come out of this in a way that doesn't hurt people's incomes too much. Also, what are some of the packages that we might need to put together to retrain people? I mentioned that. So I don't think it's going to be the case that, for example, the leisure industry is going to be able to weather some of this. And you may find that some businesses are going to need a lot of propping up. But meanwhile, you've got those workers essentially not being able to do anything potentially for a year, because I think it's probably one of the last things that will be brought back is mass gatherings. So if they're not allowed, then what is it that they are going to do? And actually, is a reskilling effort the way to go? I would argue that it would be. So yes, listen to the science, have an open system of looking at what the modeling is saying, allow other scientists who know their stuff to be able to have that debate in public. I think that makes for better decisions. It would allow MPs to be able to then hold the government to account better for the decisions it's going to make. Slowly come out of lockdown, mainly make sure we do not overwhelm the NHS, and use this as an opportunity for good. And I'll just end this little bit before I move on to Brexit by saying I do think that it won't be all doom and gloom at the end of it. It's obviously horrible, it's tragic. There are people I know who've died. There are people I know still on ventilators. This is not easy. And I just heard this morning that the latest helpful pamphlet that we will be getting as MPs is how to help people deal with grief. This is very real to a lot of families. And so we cannot detract from that. But that said, there's actually a lot of good, I think, that's coming out of this. I spent this morning at the local, they call it the community fridge, but it's basically turned into a food bank. We were packing food, and then we went out delivering it to people. And it's just the way that people have sort of come together over this is wonderful. I think the opportunities for flexible working and virtual working and all of this stuff is really exciting. I'm hearing from a lot of people that their companies just absolutely did not want to have to do it before. They felt it was too expensive and pointless, and so, but this has made them do it. There will be good things that come out of this, and we should embrace that. And maybe this is the moment also that we need to look at how do we fix social care, which now looks like it's going to be the big issue that's coming out of COVID, is the fact that the social care sector is not functioning in the way that, and it hasn't for a very long time, that way that it should. And actually this could be the wake-up call for that. So I want to keep those positive things, and I think we should be embracing the changes that are coming, and not pretend that they're not. To Brexit, I think it would be economic suicide to Brexit right now. At the end of the year, this is the moment when, if there is a vaccine, potentially, if they can manufacture enough of them, we could start to properly come out of lockdown. I mean, if I don't foresee things like, you know, big mass gatherings, lots and lots of people being crowded in restaurants, you know, busy streets and all that happening at all this year. I suspect it's going to be a socially distanced, mask wearing, you know, lots of gaps between tables if they do reopen restaurants, schools coming in and out. I mean, it's going to be really messy. But if there was to be a time that some of this might happen, it'll be after a vaccine's found, people are feeling like this is the moment, and they might do it then. And if that's the moment that we Brexit, especially on a no deal or an Australian deal, which, you know, frankly is going to harm as much, very many sectors of the economy, then I think that's economic suicide. So the question is, at what stage do the Tories realise this? And I think they probably already have. The mood music from like the lobby, which is the journalists who hang around Parliament, is that there's actually quite a big push in the Conservative Party to delay. I thought it was really interesting that Isabel Oakeshott, of all people, is being quite pragmatic about this and saying that there should be a delay. I was quite surprised to hear that, but there you are. But then I had a thought, and I have positive thoughts about Brexit every so often, and this is as positive as I get right now. Do I think that they will stop Brexit entirely? I mean, that would be obviously my like rainbow in the sky unicorn. I don't think so. However, this could be an opportunity to have a much softer Brexit. And you basically do a brino, where you say, we are leaving, but we are going to leave on almost entirely regulatory aligned, so that we don't harm the economy in any way. And then over time, we promise that we will going to relax that, and we can have, we can do that. And I can see the government doing that, sort of smoke and mirrors Brexit, to say that they've delivered. I mean, they've got an 18 majority on the basis that they will get this done, right? That was the whole election that we just had. That might be one way that they could fulfill that promise and also not harm the economy. So I wonder if that might happen. And given that it's very logical, I suspect it won't, but there you go. You're muted, Freddie.
I'm muted, sorry, yes. You mentioned the election campaign, so I thought I might ask you what went so wrong, really, and was there anything that you thought we could have done differently or should have done differently in that campaign?
So, I mean, I was quite vociferous about this after the fact, and before COVID, I was giving a few interviews, being quite open and honest about what I thought at the time had gone wrong. And I'll start by saying I don't absolve myself from responsibility for some of those decisions. I was in some of those rooms, and I think one of the things that happened was we called the election when we didn't have to. Okay, so I think that was a big mistake. And the story behind that is actually we were sort of front of the queue to do that, because at the time the worry was that Labour were going to just allow the Brexit bill to get quite far. So there was an anxiety in the party that at that point there was no majority for a people's vote. I do kind of think that was true at that point, and that's not entirely untrue. But then there was this bill that was presented. They got cross-party support with the SNP for it, but it was generated from within our party first. And I remember at the time thinking, this is a big gamble. Like, what if this actually happens? Do we really want to be going to the polls right now with all this uncertainty, knowing what happens to the third national party in elections that are that tumultuous? But I did back the call, because at the time it's sort of, you know, and Joe was really very keen that this is what we did. And so that's what you do, you fall in behind and you do that. I kind of regret that not, I think, being a bit more vociferous at that point, because I did express reservations, but I don't think I did it in a particularly strong way. And I take that on the chin. During the election itself, I think there were a couple of things we did. One, I think strategically it was stupid to go after Corbyn in the way that we did. I think it became very personal. In fact, it looked from the outside to many that we hated the Labour Party more than we hated the Tories. And we should have just gone after Johnson. Johnson was the enemy. Johnson's the one that we had to beat. In very many of our Tory-facing seats, Johnson is the main challenger. We needed to win over Tories. And in many of those seats, we needed to actually hug Labour voters quite close. That's how we won in Oxford West and Abingdon. The Greens stood down for me again, which was great. But also it had the added effect that in Labour-facing seats, like Cambridge and others, it just made us look again like we were yellow Tories, because we were fighting against Labour. And I think for those two reasons, which are complementary, I just don't understand why we did that. Hello, Murphy. Sorry, that's my cat. I don't know what she wants. So that was another one. And lastly, I think it was just a massive mistake to go the all guns blazing, we're going to be the party of government, when especially the Brexit party had stood down at this, you know, so we started those calls. I hate it. This has to happen. I mean, every single general election, the leader of the party says, yes, we can. And that is what the leader is meant to do. And yes, as Lib Dems, we are Lib Dems, not because we want to be in coalition with anyone else. I want a Lib Dem bloody government. I'm just going to let my cat out of the room, guys. I'm really sorry. She's just a bit noisy. Come on, Murph. Do you want to come say hi? Yes. There we go. Hello, everyone. This is Murphy. She's a bit grumpy. But where was I? So I was talking about...
You want to be a majority government.
Majority government. So when the Brexit party stood down, it then just became really obvious that that wasn't going to happen. And I remember then doing media. I was on Sophie Ridge when after this, we were still being asked to say that line, and we just lost all credibility. And so by the time it got to the election itself, I think people just thought, you guys you're in la la land. You don't understand. You are divisive. You want to stop Brexit. You want to revoke Article 50, which was the other thing that was coming back on doorsteps as being a bit of a mistake. Probably keeping with the people's vote was the right thing to do. Did we have to go that far? I personally felt it was quite intellectually pure, but the framing of that question was wrong. So we should have probably said something along the lines of, yes, of course we want to stop Brexit. Every MP that you elect from the Liberal Democrats is one step closer to a people's vote. But if you decided to give us a majority, then at that point we will stop Brexit, which means revoking Article 50. It's the same message but flipped on its head, and it sounds less like we are going to do this to you, rather than what I think people wanted to hear in an election, which is we want you to give us the mandate to do that, which is a different thing. And it was all about the mandate, and it was all about who has the power. So those has been my assessments of where we went wrong. But more fundamentally than that, and I'm rabbiting on, and I will try and keep my next answer shorter, I promise, and I'm sorry. But I do think there's a problem in the party about how we make big decisions. And I think back to the rooms in which I was then, and, you know, who was there? Well, actually, it was a lot of London, Southeast centric, very Remainery MPs who were making a decision for the outcomes in seats all over the country. And there was actually not that much opposition in a room. And I really worry when you don't have like dissenting voices having a good conversation in a room. There's something wrong with that room if people aren't able to go, do you know what? Have you considered this or considered that or whatever? And there was just this culture of you need to agree or shut up. And I just really think that's a big problem for us if we get ever in that state again. I really think this is an opportunity for a party to, you know, now we've got online conference. Is there a way to better feed into the parliamentary party quicker if we are the ones who have to take this decision? I'm really keen for this to happen. We cannot let ourselves only be listening to the echo chamber within the echo chamber within the echo chamber again. We have to make sure we never do that. Right, I promise I will keep it shorter.
Wonderful, thank you very much. So I'm just going to let Sam ask a couple of questions, and then we've got a huge number of questions from our members who
Great.
have some
All
very
right,
interesting questions.
quick
Sam,
fire.
go away.
So one thing I'm quite interested in is obviously, and to move things away from the coronavirus discussion a little bit, is Starmer, of course, has put Rebecca Long-Bailey as Shadow Education Secretary, and
Yep.
Anne Taylor is now Deputy Leader. So it looks to me like Labour might commit more heavily to their education policies that we saw emerge under Corbyn. And given your role as education spokesperson, I'm really interested to see how the Lib Dems plan to sort of rebut in the coming years, the claim that private schools, or the move towards private schools being abolished, for example, and just in general, how the Lib Dems will formulate an education policy that will differentiate itself from Labour's.
Right. So first of all, that's really interesting that that's your view of how you see that, because that's not what I saw. When I saw that Rebecca Long-Bailey was put into that role, I kind of felt like, ooh, he's clearly not taking education that seriously, is he? Mm-hmm. Because I don't think there has really been much that Rebecca Long-Bailey has said in the past about education. She isn't an educationalist. She doesn't have that story that Angela Rayner does, actually, about opportunity, and she's got a great backstory, Angela Rayner. And for what it's worth, I mean, Angela Rayner is, I think, a brilliant politician, but she's no educationalist. So I'm not sure that necessarily that's the case, that they're going to sort of aggressively go after that, but let's see. I mean, I just hadn't considered it, and you're probably right, and we need to be prepared for that. Every time that the problem we have actually as Liberal Democrats is not our policies on education. I'm really quite proud of where we've ended up right now with our education policies. I think we can go further. There's a commission that I started actually 2 years ago that's nearly ready to put out its report. We're at the writing up stage, which is going to suggest some pretty radical stuff, including moving to a system that's got way fewer exams. And we're not just talking about SATs, possibly even, thinking about what's the purpose of GCSEs, much more intertwined academic and vocational work, and also a rethink about, and I think at some point, I'm afraid we're going to have to talk again about tuition fees and talk about student finance. And I do think that that's something we need to do. And it was one of the things I kind of wanted to do this year, is for the party to have that discussion. To the point about private schools, I mean, look, I went to one and I taught in them. And I nevertheless think that some of them do a pretty good job of reaching out into the community, and I've got many of them here actually who have done just that, particularly at this time of crisis. They have really stepped up and have earned their charitable status. I think there's a lot of them, frankly, though, that take the piss and seem to think that sponsoring the odd cricket match and allowing the poor kids to come and use their stuff when they don't need it is enough. And I'm sorry, that's just not enough. And so the policy that I'd like to bring to conference to discuss is one where private schools don't have the automatic right to charitable status. They have to earn it. And at the moment, actually, not all private schools do have charitable status, I should add. Some of them are just overtly profit-making. And you know what? If they're overtly profit-making, and therefore there is no subsidy from the state, there are issues around you need to be encouraging people to mix, and I do still have an issue with that, and I think it needs to be taken into account. But nevertheless, they worry me less in moral terms than those who are getting a massive subsidy from the state by being charities, when in fact they're not giving very much back. For me, that's the middle ground, and I don't think that we should worry too much about what Labour are saying on this, because actually I think they end up sounding a bit over the top, and I don't know if Rebecca Long-Bailey is going to be able to put forward policies like that under the new regime. But the jury is very much still out about Keir Starmer and his team and what they're going to do and where he's going to take the party. So let's give that a moment, I think, to work through. We will have to be distinctive, but I'm not going to do it because I don't want to be Labour. I want to do it because I've spent my entire life being a teacher. It's my specialty, it's my master's, it's my passion. I'm going to do it because it's the right thing for the children of this country, and not because it's something distinctive from Labour.
You mentioned tuition fees, which I think leads quite nicely to another question I have. Obviously, you're in the sort of the intake, the post-coalition intake. And I'd be really interested to hear sort of what you think the Lib Dems should make of the coalition in campaigning. Should it be something that we are proud of, that we celebrate, or should we, do you think, sort of distance ourselves from it a little bit and make it very clear that we're a very new party that doesn't need to be sort of haunted by memories of our time in government?
Yeah, I would say neither. It's not that, that's not the choice. It's a bit like saying that you can get rid of your childhood. You can't. That doesn't mean you can't learn from it and move off in a different direction. And so I think there are things that went well in coalition, and I'm very proud of things like the pupil premium, and actually we got some great green energy policies in there, and actually there's stuff to be proud of. That said, I think there is a lot that we got wrong, and tuition fees is a really good example. But the main thing we got wrong, and it wasn't even the policy itself, because that's been well documented that in some ways it's more fair than the old system, but the problem was we lost trust. And that's what we lost. It wasn't any one policy that did it. It was that plus health and social care. You can point to them. But actually, even just going into coalition in the first place lost trust with some people. And the evidence that we lost it was how difficult elections have been since. And in places where they elect Lib Dems at a local level, and I've been doing a bit of door knocking before COVID lockdown, I was really, really keen to, not launch a leadership bid on the back of, actually, I know what's best alone for the party. I want to go and listen to, actually not even members at that point. I wanted to go and talk to our voters, because I know my voters in Oxford West and Abingdon, but do I know them in Sheffield and Leeds, and do I know them in Cornwall? And actually Cambridge was very much on the list of a place I was going to come to next, because I wanted to go talk to seats that were kind of different from mine, because yours is Labour facing, so it's really important that we understand them. And what was coming back over and over again was, yeah, tuition fees, but trust. And that combined with, we don't know who you are. Who are you post-Brexit? What are you? And so I think that's what we need to take away from what went wrong in coalition, is we need to be really careful that we earn people's trust back again. And you do that by campaigning on the issues that they really care about, taking time to listen to what it is that's going to help them and their family. There is a perception among the voters that I was talking to that we've become a bit of a niche party. We talk about the extremes of Brexit. We were all about revoke, but we were also the party that in the election decided to spend a whole day talking about gender neutral school uniforms. Now, don't get me wrong. That's a policy that I put a bill for. It's important stuff to a lot of people. But if you've got a whole day as a party talking about one thing, and you're trying to get voters to vote for you, why is it that we chose? Like, it just is so niche, and it's not even relevant to most people. Actually, let's talk about the cost of school uniforms. If you're going to talk about school uniforms, talk about how expensive they are, and actually that lots of families can't afford them. I'd rather that. So let's think about the voters that we want to win over, talk about the things that they really care about, maybe even make some change in those areas and win their trust back. And that actually is, I think, where we need to be going as a party. And then when you talk about coalition, I think you can say there were some good things, there were some bad things, we've learned from them, but this is what we need to focus on now, and then just talk about the future. The honest answer to your question is, I'd much rather not talk about coalition at all.
Thank you very much. So I think we'll now start taking a couple of questions from our membership. We've had a number, and I'm going to start with, let me just properly unmute myself so I don't have to hold the space bar. Let's start with this one from Alfie to bring it back to coronavirus. And you mentioned briefly about the police, but what do you think specifically around the coronavirus bill that's recently been rushed through Parliament? Obviously, it's got quite considerable emergency powers, though some of the powers are found in existing public health legislation. And what do you think about the enforcement that's happened so far, and the timeline for actually getting those powers preferably off the books as quickly as as soon as they're not needed anymore?
Absolutely. I mean, look, I think what we are going to find right now, there is a general acceptance that the lockdown, and even among the vast majority of people, I think, support the police in the way that they've been using the powers, and that they think that they ought to be able to have the powers to disperse barbecues on fields and things like that. I think where we have seen the powers, or even police officers overstepping the mark, that has been sat on quite heavily, even by Tories, I know, because they feel that we police by consent and that they've gone a bit too far. And there is a difference between, you know, a police officer giving you advice or even fining you when they shouldn't be, actually is a detriment to themselves, because when this is all over, they're going to lose the trust of some of those populations. That's a really bad thing. So I'm hopeful that over time, when breaches like we've seen over the weekend, so we saw there was that I think it was, I can't remember the police force, but it was somewhere north, and there was that police officer saying you can't play in your front gardens. I think there's been quite a lot of fines and people being stopped in cars in Cambridge for going into the outer areas in order to be able to have a green space to be able to walk around in. Now, some of this is just common sense, and the police forces are applying it differently in different places. So I think it's in their own interests to not be over the top with it and apply common sense more. We haven't really had that much of an issue with any of this in Oxfordshire. So it very is clearly something that's different in different parts of the country, and that does kind of worry me. But to the broader point, I think this is where our liberalism and our liberal values and our liberal instincts are really important. So, you know, I've been doing some reading recently. I've been doing some reading of Isaiah Berlin, and those who may have read his essays on liberty. And it's reminding me, I think we've got an interesting case study for some of his work, in my view, because, you know, he talks about positive and negative freedoms. And I think as liberals, we often start from the point of view of the negative freedoms, which is, you know, you should basically be uninterfered with until there's a very good reason to do that. But we basically start by saying no one should be interfered with. But we find ourselves in a situation where we have allowed the state to dictate to people what to do in order to be collectively responsible for the way that we are responding to coronavirus. And my concern is, and the argument that he makes is that actually it's very often these positive freedoms, these clamping down freedoms for the good of everyone's collective freedom, that can easily slip into authoritarianism and go a bit too far. And I think we just need to be really live to the fact that this could happen. I think in reality in this country, we are hopefully some way away from that, but I think we should watch this internationally, and there is an international response, and certainly there will be parts of the world that will be using this to increase surveillance powers, increase the state. I've already spoken about, you know, transparency around this app, which as far as I can work out is basically based on Bumble, where if you pass someone, your phones know that they've passed each other and they store the data, and then the NHS is going to be able to tell who you've been near and send them alerts and things. I mean, so long as there's transparency around it, I don't think it should be necessarily mandated that everyone has to download the app. You need to be incentivizing people in a positive way to download the app, and I suspect most people will. You do it in a way that is liberal and transparent and is very, very much reviewed very frequently. And I think that's how you stop accidentally ending up in a situation where you are overusing powers without due regard to the fact that we live in a liberal democracy.
We've got a question from Becky. You actually mentioned earlier that it's a shame that sort of the Labour leadership election has taken up a lot of the sort of news cycle. So if you're elected, how would you try and grab media attention? And do you think our strategies have previously been a bit too conventional?
Well, first of all, we have to accept sort of where we are. You know, we are at the moment certainly political minnows, is the way I'd put it, and the newspapers are just, you know, full of COVID, and they want to hear from the ding dong of the two major parties. You know, our position after the election has really not helped us at all, our poll rating either. So I think there is going to be limited scope for how much we are able to, just to be blunt and very honest with you, how much we're going to be able to push in that boundary. That said, I do think that there are times that we can be faster, we can be pithier, we can be stronger with the lines that we use. Where we have achieved cut through is when we've, you know, been quick off the mark with something distinctive to say. And I do think there is more that we can do there. But actually, I'll come to a different point, because actually some of that is about how we get in the news, and there's lots of training that we've all done on that as parliamentarians, how we can do that better. And there's something we're talking about quite a lot right now. How do we keep doing that? So I've been writing a lot of op-eds. I'm trying to get in on the conversation in that way. But before, you used to get invited to Newsnight all the time, and now we just don't anymore. And it's really hard to sort of get yourself on shows like that. You have to really be asked. To the other part of it, though, I do think there's a lot more we could do around social media. And I'm sure many of you will have seen Tim Farron's foray into TikTok. It was wonderful. But that's the kind of thing I think we should be able to do. You know, we are the third party. We are, on average, the youngest party, albeit that average is 50, but nevertheless, we do have, I think, the ability and the space to be able to have a bit more fun with the way that we reach people. I'd be really keen, for example, and I think one of the things we need to work on is, if we're going to build a big base for the future, we really do need to be focusing on young people. So why not, you know, do more with, you know, classic influencers and try and get on their YouTube channels, and you know, there's all this stuff, there's all this new media that we should be able to be engaging with as politicians, and we're just not, and I don't think anyone is. So there's a clear space for us to try. If we try and fail, so what? You know, now is the time, and unless we start carving out those niches for ourselves, and you could argue this is how the American far right got its toehold, right? You know, it basically bypassed the mainstream media that wasn't serving it, and it found other ways of doing it. I'm not saying we follow them in their footsteps with the same outlets, but nevertheless, you know, they found another way. I'm not sure as liberals we've actually embraced the fact that there's other ways of reaching people.
Thank you very much. Josh asks, you know, you obviously want to run for leader yourself. If you were elected leader, what would be your penny on income tax for education? What would you want to make the leadership of the legacy of your leadership of the party?
Yeah, well, actually, it's interesting that you say that, because actually, unsurprisingly, I think it is education. That is why I went into politics in the first place. And as I say, whilst I went to private schools and taught in some of them, nevertheless, I don't think that education should be something that is just available to the people who can afford it. I think one of the things that made me angry was, and it was very maybe naive of me, but in my teens and early 20s, I just kind of, I moved around to lots of different countries. I'd lived in like Ethiopia, Jamaica, Jordan, and Greece, and all sorts of different countries, and I just hadn't really realized how bad educational inequality in our country was. And so it wasn't until I did a master's that I properly studied it, understood it, got me angry, and that's what got me into politics. And I do think there is a niche there. And I don't think that Labour have captured it. You know, they will be the party for the workers. I don't think the Tories naturally know how to do it. They are still very much of the mindset that, you know, everyone can just, if they work hard enough, get A's at A level, and, you know, that's your fault if you don't really get there. And I do think that there is a very distinctive position that we could carve out in that sphere, which is also my passion. So it is that. But I also think that needs to be combined with some of the other big issues. I think any party, but particularly ours, that goes into an election without talking about climate change is absolutely missing the most important pressing issue that's facing the planet. It actually dwarfs coronavirus as a problem, because the thing about that is that unless we get there in the 11 years that we've got left, or whatever it is now, it's not a problem that might go away at some point. It's a problem that could stay with us forever. And so that is a crisis, and we need to be tackling that and talking about it seriously. So I think those would be two very important policy points that I would want to really push forward. And then there's a third part, which is, I think, about actually talking about our communities and talking about how we relate to each other. It's a bit softer, it's a bit more about mental health and well-being, but also about cooperation. And this is where I often bring in points around not being so tribal with other parties, standing on your own 2 feet. I'm absolutely not someone who advocates that we are at all any offshoot of any other party. If I wanted to join them, I could have done. I'm sure, like all of you, other people have suggested we do. I'm not. I am a Liberal Democrat, and I have my own distinctive policy position. But I do think that there is space to be working in a non-tribal way with other parties for the things we agree on. And top of that list is things like proportional representation.
Thank you. So I think you've got to go in about 10 minutes. So I'm just going to ask for maybe like quick fire answers.
All right.
But whilst I'm saying that, I've just been reading the questions that our members have been asking, and they are incredibly complicated policy questions. So
Okay.
I'm sorry about that. So Hannah, who is a medic, has two questions about the impacts of coronavirus and the NHS. So her first question is that Laura Gordon, who ran for us in Sheffield Hallam, has observed that she thinks decentralized parts of the NHS, places where sourcing ventilators, increasing ICU beds are, that's done internally, seem to have performed better than more centralized parts, especially PPE sourcing and testing, which has been very highly centralized by Public Health England. Do you think that's true? And, what do you think to that? And secondly, Hannah has asked about mental health problems, specifically in survivors of critical care interventions, and what support should we be pushing for? And to combine that in with another mental health question, Astrid was asking more about the potential for a, basically a mental health crisis as people are locked inside for so long. Sorry to lump all of those into one.
Okay. So on the observation that Laura Gordon's made, I've also made the same observation. And this is one of the reasons why I mentioned earlier, I've been calling for transparency of who sits on stage. Because my understanding is that a lot of the public health experts who are expert in how the NHS works at a public health level, the interplay between local authorities and the delivery of things like PPE and ventilators, the way that the CCGs, whatever, how they all then are packaged around public health, those people who are expert in that aren't sitting on stage. And I think that has caused all sorts of problems in understanding where the bottlenecks in the system were going to be. And yes, I do think that there's going to be some review of the NHS that maybe will happen after the fact. There's also another strand to this, which is, we have done pandemic exercises before in government, and Philip Lee, in fact, came to talk to my membership around this. It was absolutely fascinating. It's clear that a lot of these issues had been identified, and I think there's a really important question to be asking around, why did we not see that some of these issues were coming? So on the mental health point, yeah, I completely agree. I think on critical care, people who receive critical care, and even those who have just been in hospital but maybe didn't have the ventilator part but have had that scary experience, them and their families, they are looking at weeks, months, if not even over a year. A friend of mine's father was just told that he might not be back to normal for over a year, having come off the intervention. It's going to be really difficult. So you're absolutely right, they do need looking after. I think right now it's just get people through this. But I do think there's the other side to this, which is the grief part. There are a lot of families who are grieving the fact that their loved one died alone. And that's just unconscionable, that we have got a situation where we've just accepted this as a society. There's now a relaxing of rules around funerals. So my understanding is that some counties are now allowing funerals of up to 10 people, properly socially distanced, so that you can be there and start to grieve and go through that process. But nevertheless, a big part of it is coming together as family and friends, celebrating their life. None of that can be done. And that needs addressing, and it's going to last for way longer than the crisis itself, is that grieving process that society hasn't been able to get through. And then the third part is, yes, I mean, people are just, that social isolation, the joy today of dropping off parcels to people and then just having that quick conversation with them on the doorstep from 3 meters away, it filled my heart. And it made me realize how much I personally am suffering from just not having, and this is lovely, but you just don't get the same, it's just not quite the same. And yeah, I do think that is going to, the longer this goes on, be an issue. We have called, by the way, for an increase in money to go to Mind and other charities that do this really well. They actually are suffering because they don't have enough donations to come in to meet the demand. And so actually I think that's a place where government has stepped in. Munira Wilson, my colleague who covers health, has already done that, and I've backed that call.
On the topic of curbing civil liberties and so on, we have a question from Laura, who's our vice chair. who says that we have accepted very serious curbs on our liberty as a result of this emergency in the interest of public safety. Do you think the government should seek to curb freedom of speech on people who intentionally spread misinformation? And the example she gives is viral theories like coronavirus can't be spread outside because of the sun.
Right. My instinct at that stage is to go, no, I don't think you stop that, because it's a really fine line to then decide what you do allow. And freedom of speech to me is such a fundamental freedom of a free society that I would just be really concerned about just saying yes to that question. Although that said, I have a lot of sympathy for those who suggest that we should do that, especially when it is potentially dangerous. Because actually you could argue that it's akin to inciting violence. It's inciting harm on people if they then believe it and then do something that is dangerous. So there is a debate and a line that has to be drawn somewhere, but I think we need to be very careful about doing that. I would much rather actually you start where the basics are. I mean, I actually genuinely think that the government has not done a very good job of communicating in this crisis. It took a very long time for it to start its daily press conferences. I've already spoken about how I don't think there's enough transparency around the decisions that are being made. And I think they can answer questions far straighter than they have been. I think if the government was better at communicating in this time of crisis, then we would worry less about that kind of thing. And then the other strand to that I think is worth mentioning is, you know, the social media companies have kind of stepped up and apparently now have algorithms by which they are trying to take these things down. But I do think there's a lot more that they can do. I mean, they are making a packet. My understanding is that Zoom, for example, has just been, I can't remember what its valuation was, but it is incredibly high. Like, I'm sorry, these companies, all of them, are making an absolute packet. They should and should have been doing more earlier to tackle these kinds of things. I think that you do that by, you know, reporting and being able to flag things that are, you know, theories that are disproven, pointing people to sites that are more reliable than not. There's all sorts of ways you can do it without shutting down people's ability to speak, because I think that just creates a pressure cooker on people's ability to speak, and I'm not sure that's necessarily the way to go.
Okay, so we've got 5 minutes remaining, so I'm going to ask you two slightly more, you know, bread and butter policy questions, the sort of questions we'd have been asking, you know, had you made it to CULA without this pandemic.
Yeah,
the first one,
those are the days.
yes, the first one is from Hannah again, who asks, how do we as a party promote a liberal approach to house building, so to tackle the housing crisis, which seemed like such a crisis just 4 months ago, and obviously hasn't gone away, while at least what some of us have noticed is that our party, because we've got a lot of councillors who generally represent a lot of homeowners, tend to be slightly prone towards what some might call NIMBYism. And the second question from Angus is, should a balanced budget continue to be part of our policy platform? And points out that at the last general election, we pledged that we'd run a 1% surplus.
I'll take the second one first. So first of all, I think we need to have the economic response that is right at the time of when the election is called. And I think that is very much, it depends on when that's going to happen in the state of the economy at the time. I've been trying to do some reading around this. And I recognized actually when I was elected that understanding macroeconomics in particular was a particular flaw. So I took a course and I've been trying to sort of understand how this works and doing a lot of reading around it. My understanding is that even those economists that are fairly conservative in their fiscal view are saying that we should be keeping the taps on for a very long time and making sure that we achieve full recovery before we do anything around ensuring that we start turning them off again. So if the election were tomorrow, I would say absolutely not. And in fact, I think it would be very detrimental to do that for the economy and for the future prospects of the country. So, but it really will depend on the state of play at the time that the election is called. And I think that's the right way to frame the manifesto. To the point around house building, absolutely. I mean, you know, and I often make the point that, yeah, I own this house, but I own it with my sister, with the help of mum and dad, and only because I've got an MP salary. There is something wrong with the world that is the case. And I fully understand the frustration that people feel that there just isn't a functioning house market. Now, there's a few reasons why that's happened. And in Oxford West and Abingdon, there's always been this tension between we need to build more houses, but also we have the green belt issue, which I know other university towns do as well. Our view has always been, we want to build lots of houses, but we want to do it in a way that is environmentally sustainable, and we want to do it in a way that has public support. And that doesn't mean that we say no to it, but what we do is we make sure that it is something that people have bought into, with the right infrastructure, with zero carbon homes, with enough small homes that people who want to get onto the ladder are able to buy. And I think there is a false debate, frankly, that is a bit black and white, that says those Lib Dem councils that are opposing things in some parts of the country are doing it because they just don't want to build and they don't care about people who aren't on the housing ladder. Now, guys, I just don't believe that's true. Actually, the reason why we oppose it, and we've got a big development here on the green belt in Kidlington, is because we've seen from elsewhere the starting price of any one of the houses that have been built in similar areas is like £300,000. That's not what the average nurse locally can afford. That's not what the average student can afford. It's not for them that these houses are being built. They are executive homes that people are going to be buying because they want to leave London and they've got a small family and they're already bankers, right? That's not going to solve the housing crisis. And what we push for is, actually, can we build smaller housing, more subsidized by local councils, that actually are zero carbon and are a proper way to give people the homes that they want. So I just don't like this idea that it's one or the other. And, you know, if you say no to building, that you're a NIMBY. Actually, the same reason we're saying no very often is the reason that we both agree on, which is that we want more houses that are affordable to people who are trying to get their foot on the ladder. And the reason we're saying no is because actually the market itself is broken and we need to fix that. But I'll just say one more thing on this point. I think the other thing that we do seriously need to look at now is the fact that there are a lot of very asset rich older people, and we need to now ask, how do we get them to release some of these properties for other people to be able to buy and live in now? And the issue we have there is that in this country, people used houses not as houses and homes, but they used them as investments. And there was something actually wrong with the way that our financial markets were working, that the way people saw pensions. And that is the more intractable problem. I actually don't have a solution to that, but I think we need to appreciate that that is something that's quite specific to this country. Other countries didn't do this in the same way, but we have. And you may know people, and it may even be your parents, who own several houses, one of which is for when we retire. Well, the problem with that is that, you know, that means that they are hogging that house when they don't need it. So how do we get them to release it? And actually, I'd love for others who understand this stuff perhaps more intricately than I to look at that problem, because I think it's the core and the root of some of the issues.
Thank you very much. So I think you're gonna have to go, but I just want to plug. That's okay. I just want to plug our charity drive as a society, and in combination with the Labour Club, the Conservative Association, a number of feminist societies, we are doing a big charity drive for the Cambridge Women's Shelter, which provides crucial support, especially right now with horrible reports of domestic violence cases rising at the moment. So I just want to suggest that all our members will be doing a big pledge for that. Spirited discussions later today. Thank you very much, Layla, for coming along. It's been fascinating to hear all your answers. And
it's my pleasure. Thank you so much, Freddie and Sam and everyone else. And
very much.
If there's anything more I can do, and, you know, let me know if there's anything you want me to retweet to get donations to the refuge or whatever it is. That's brilliant that you're doing that, and thank you for all that you're doing to, you know,
thank you very much. And we
after themselves.
And we hope to invite you to Cambridge soon.
I know.
When
See
we're
you
back.
in person. We'll go for a pint. Yes.
Yes, absolutely. You can come to one of our spirited discussions. I'm sure you've heard of the Oxford ones.
Have. We have them here.
They're much better in Cambridge. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, everyone. Take care and stay safe.